From the moment you step into the old family home, there's a chill that clings to the air, a sense that time itself has decided to stay silent. Imagine a Victorian house, walls yellowed with age, floorboards whispering with every creak. But this isn't just any house. It belonged to a woman whose name was spoken in hushed tones, a mother whose love was twisted, whose protection became imprisonment. She lived in a world where innocence and cruelty danced so closely together that sometimes it was impossible to tell where one ended and the other began. What you're about to hear is not merely a story. It is a descent into the hidden shadows of American domestic life, a story so dark it challenges everything we believe about family love and loyalty. This woman shaped the lives of her children in ways that would haunt generations. And the deeper you look, the more you'll realize that some truths are too frightening to confront, but too vital to ignore. Her legacy is not one of prosperity or fame, but of a quiet, almost surgical terror, a manipulation so subtle yet so complete that it left scars no one could erase. Born into a world of rigid social expectations and Victorian morality, she understood the power of appearances. To the outside world, she was the perfect mother, attentive, devoted, even saintly in her eyes. But behind closed doors, she orchestrated a household governed by fear and obsession. Every meal, every bedtime story, every whispered admonishment was a calculated step toward controlling the very hearts of those she was supposed to nurture. Her children grew up in a labyrinth where love was indistinguishable from punishment, where affection was earned only through compliance and rebellion. Even the smallest spark of individuality was met with a cold, relentless force that no one dared challenge. Over the years, her reputation became a veil. To neighbors, she was gentle and caring. To her family, she was the axis around which their world twisted, their lives contorted into patterns of trauma so intricate that they didn't even realize they were trapped. And yet, as horrifying as her methods were, they were not born of random cruelty. Every action, every decision was a deliberate act of molding her children into extensions of her own will, her own vision of perfection. They weren't just her children. They were her instruments, her experiments, her mirrors reflecting the darkness she refused to confront in herself. When historians finally peeled back the layers of letters, journals, and court records, what emerged was a portrait not just of a mother, but of a carefully constructed nightmare. Her control over her household was not limited to mere discipline. It extended into the very psychology of her children. She understood, perhaps instinctively, that fear and love are two sides of the same coin, and she wielded both with terrifying precision. A misstep at the dinner table, a glance too bold, a laugh too loud, each could summon a storm of reproach that lingered long after the punishment was over. Yet she did not punish blindly. No, each reprimand, each manipulation was measured, calibrated to break down the child's sense of self while reinforcing her own supremacy. In her mind, she was sculpting virtue from chaos, but the virtue she demanded was more of a shadow than a light, a reflection of herself rather than a true independence of spirit. Her children, though outwardly well-mannered and intelligent, carried invisible chains. They were taught that deviation was sin, curiosity was rebellion, and love was conditional. Imagine growing up in a house where every smile had an edge, every gesture of affection was entangled with expectation, and every dream you dared to speak aloud was quietly dismantled before it could breathe. She didn't just punish mistakes, she punished potential. And those who thought themselves safe, who believed that obedience would shield them, soon discovered that no measure of compliance could satisfy her hunger for control. In the shadows of her home, the psychological games took on a darker, almost ritualistic quality. She watched, studied, and recorded. Minor accidents became lessons in obedience. Minor victories became demonstrations of loyalty. Each child learned, through trial and error, what behavior would earn a nod and what would earn silence, so heavy it felt like a physical weight pressing against their chest. As they grew, so too did the intricacy of her strategies. She was not content with overt control. She demanded internalized obedience. By the time her children were teenagers, they were already acting out roles written for them before they had even learned to speak properly. And yet, despite the oppressive darkness, her children were drawn to her in ways that confound logic. Fear mixed with love, dread mixed with longing, and the line between devotion and captivity blurred. To the outside world, they were a picture, perfect family, polite, composed, even charming. But behind closed doors, the mother's grip was a force invisible yet absolute, a gravity from which there was no escape. It is this duality, the beautiful facade masking an inescapable horror, that makes her story not just disturbing, but unforgettable. By the time the children reached adulthood, the mother's influence had calcified into something almost pathological. Her household had become a microcosm of control, a pressure cooker where individuality was slowly crushed under the weight of her expectations. It was no longer enough that they obeyed. She demanded that they think as she thought, feel as she felt, and even desire what she desired. Every choice, every relationship, every ambition had to be filtered through her judgment, leaving the children with little sense of self outside her presence. Some tried to escape, only to find that her influence extended beyond the walls of the home. Letters intercepted, friends discouraged, suitors questioned. Nothing slipped past her scrutiny. What makes her story particularly harrowing is that her actions were not overtly violent. She did not beat or bruise. Her weapon was far more subtle and far more devastating. Words, silences, calculated neglect, and unpredictable affection became instruments of psychological warfare. Imagine a child learning to read the slightest change in tone, the faintest shift in posture, the invisible signal that determined whether they were safe or condemned. This constant vigilance, this perpetual fear of imperfection, etched itself into their minds. They grew into adults who were competent, even brilliant, but haunted by shadows that no therapist could fully exorcise. Even more disturbing is how she managed to disguise this tyranny under a veneer of propriety. To neighbors, church members, and distant relatives, she was a paragon of maternal devotion. Letters praising her meticulous housekeeping and social grace circulated freely, while the true nature of her household remained hidden. It is a reminder of how easily evil can masquerade as virtue when wrapped in the right clothing, how psychological manipulation can leave no visible scars yet shape lives irreversibly. And as historians have uncovered her correspondence and journals, the true extent of her obsession with control emerges. She documented not only the actions of her children, but their emotional states, their fears, their secret desires, every detail catalogued with a precision that chills the soul. She was not merely raising children, she was conducting an experiment, a prolonged study in the malleability of human emotion under the weight of relentless oversight. And the most terrifying aspect, she seems to have believed, with a conviction bordering on mania, that she was justified, even benevolent. Her obsession with control did not end with simple behavior or obedience. It extended into the very bonds between her children, manipulating their relationships with one another in ways that were subtle, insidious, and at times cruelly divisive. Sibling rivalries were not left to chance. She nurtured them, stoked them, and redirected them as tools to reinforce her dominance. Love and loyalty were constantly tested, reshaped, and redirected to ensure that her authority remained unchallenged. In some cases, children found themselves pitted against one another, not out of natural conflict, but because their mother had engineered the tension, teaching them that affection must be earned at the expense of someone else. She also exerted an almost surgical influence over their social lives. Friends were carefully chosen or rejected, not on the basis of compatibility, but on whether they might serve her vision of propriety or inadvertently offer an alternative perspective to her carefully constructed reality. Romantic interests were closely scrutinized, sometimes discouraged outright, sometimes subtly sabotaged, leaving her children emotionally dependent on her approval. Even in adolescence, when the desire for independence should have been strongest, they found themselves tethered by invisible cords, their desires reshaped to mirror the will of the woman who had raised them in shadows and whispered instructions. The long-term consequences of this control are difficult to overstate. Her children carried her manipulations into adulthood, often repeating patterns of dependency, fear, and self-doubt. Those who attempted to break free were haunted by guilt, conditioned to believe that any act of independence was an act of betrayal. And yet, there were moments when they glimpsed the horrifying reality of her grip, moments that left permanent scars on their psyche. Some turned inward, some outward, but none truly escaped the shadow she cast. It is here, in the manipulation of familial bonds, that her cruelty reaches its most unsettling depth. She was not content with shaping individual minds. She shaped a network of dependency, an entire ecosystem of psychological control. Each child's emotions, ambitions, and loyalties were instruments in her symphony of dominance, creating a home where every word, gesture, and thought could be subtly, or not so subtly, redirected to serve her ends. And it is in this quiet, pervasive manipulation, more than in any physical act, that the true horror of her story resides. By the time the children reached their late teens, her influence had become nearly absolute. Every decision they made, every impulse they felt, had been filtered through her gaze for so long that they no longer knew where their own thoughts ended and hers began. This was not merely control, it was a rewriting of identity. Some historians compare it to a form of psychological captivity rarely documented in American domestic history. A mother whose authority became a force as binding as any prison wall, yet invisible to the outside world. She did not allow mistakes to go unnoticed, but she also never provided guidance that might foster independence. Instead, she set impossible standards, creating a cycle where failure was inevitable, and correction always reinforced her supremacy. Imagine living in a house where even success was measured by how closely it reflected her desires, where a child's achievements were never their own, but always extensions of the mother's will. It is a subtle form of terror, one that leaves no outward bruises, but reshapes the soul, embedding insecurity and self-doubt so deep that escape feels both impossible and incomprehensible. Worse still, she seemed to relish the tension between fear and affection. Her love was not unconditional, it was earned, tested, and withdrawn with a precision that was almost surgical. A simple misstep, a mispronounced word, a glance that lingered too long, could result in weeks of cold indifference. And yet when she chose to bestow approval, it felt like salvation, a fleeting moment of warmth that drew the children ever closer to her, binding them in a paradoxical mix of devotion and dread. This careful orchestration of emotion was the hallmark of her cruelty, a psychological manipulation so complete that it became the invisible architecture of their lives. And yet, in the historical records, she is often described with terms that seem almost innocent: devoted, meticulous, dignified. This duality, an outwardly perfect Victorian mother who conducted a private reign of terror, is what makes her story so haunting. It is a reminder that darkness can live quietly behind the most serene facades, and that the most disturbing truths often hide in plain sight, where they are least expected but most insidious. As her children grew into adulthood, the consequences of her manipulation became tragically clear. Their relationships outside the home were strained, their sense of self fragile, and their capacity for trust diminished. Many carried the invisible scars of a childhood spent under constant surveillance, where every choice was a test and every expression of independence was met with disapproval. Some sought refuge in isolation, others in rebellion, but none could fully escape the imprint of her will. It was as though the walls of her Victorian home had extended into their minds, shaping thoughts and emotions long after they had physically left. She was particularly adept at twisting love into obligation. Marriage, for instance, was never just a personal choice. It became another arena in which she could exercise control. Potential partners were scrutinized for compatibility not with her children's happiness, but with her own ideas of propriety and loyalty. Any deviation from her expectations was a subtle but powerful warning. Independence was dangerous and love was conditional. Even as adults, her children often found themselves negotiating with her influence, trying to assert autonomy while fearing the repercussions of defiance. The result was a generation trapped between devotion and terror, loyalty and resentment, a psychological limbo that few could navigate without long-lasting consequences. The psychological impact of her actions cannot be overstated. Modern historians and psychologists who have studied her case describe it as a form of covert tyranny, a sustained manipulation that erodes the sense of self and replaces it with a constructed identity dictated by another. Her legacy was not a matter of wealth or notoriety, but of invisible chains, habits of thought, patterns of emotion, and a pervasive sense of inadequacy that haunted her children well into their own adult lives. It is the kind of horror that doesn't end with the closing of a door or the passing of time. It lingers, insidious and silent, in every decision, every relationship, and every self-doubt. And yet, despite the suffering, there was also a disturbing allure to her power. Her children were bound to her not only by fear, but by a twisted form of devotion, a psychological gravity that made leaving both painful and incomprehensible. It is this combination of manipulation, control, and subtle seduction of the psyche that cements her place as one of the most disturbing maternal figures in American history. A woman whose legacy is as haunting as it is instructive, a cautionary tale of the power a parent can wield over the mind and heart of a child. What makes her story even more unsettling is the way she embedded secrecy into the very fabric of her family. Outside observers saw only a polished exterior, genteel dinners, proper manners, and the illusion of normalcy. Letters to distant relatives spoke of health, education, and refinement, leaving no hint of the invisible chains she maintained at home. Even servants, friends, and neighbors remained largely unaware, unable to penetrate the layers of control she had erected. It is this ability to conceal cruelty behind civility that has fascinated historians and psychologists alike. How easily terror can masquerade as propriety, how the most harrowing abuses can thrive under a cloak of respectability. She also cultivated a sense of inevitability within her household. Her children were taught, subtly but consistently, that her rules were natural laws, her desires were unquestionable, and her judgment was absolute. Over time, obedience became reflex, not choice. They internalized her voice, thinking her thoughts even when she was not present, a form of self-surveillance that ensured her dominion extended far beyond her immediate presence. Every success, every failure, every moral or emotional choice was filtered through her expectations, leaving the children ill-equipped to make independent decisions without guilt or fear. Perhaps most disturbing is the way this environment warped the children's perception of love and trust. Relationships were transactional, emotions were instruments, and intimacy was inseparable from obligation. They learned to associate care with surveillance, affection with evaluation, and loyalty with fear. Even long after leaving the house, many could not disentangle genuine emotion from the conditioning they had endured. It is a chilling reminder that trauma need not be loud or violent to leave deep, lasting scars. Sometimes, the quietest manipulations are the most insidious, the most enduring. By examining her methods, we see a portrait not just of a mother, but of a carefully maintained psychological ecosystem. She was an architect of fear and devotion, a master of the invisible forces that shape minds and hearts. And while the world outside remained blissfully unaware, inside her home, she wove a reality that was as intricate as it was inescapable. A reality where love, fear, obedience, and identity were all bound to her will. By the time the family's story began to reach the public, the depth of her influence became undeniable. Historians poring over letters, journals, and court records were struck not only by the extent of her control, but by the psychological sophistication behind it. She had created an environment that was simultaneously nurturing and imprisoning, comforting and terrifying, a home where children learned that their survival depended on submission to her will. It is rare to encounter a figure whose cruelty is so silent, so calculated, and yet so profoundly damaging that it continues to reverberate decades later. What sets her apart from other historical figures is the subtlety of her methods. She did not need to resort to overt violence, because she understood that fear could be administered in small, almost imperceptible increments. A withheld glance, a sharp word disguised as concern, a carefully timed withdrawal of affection. These were her tools. Over years, they produced effects more devastating than any physical punishment could achieve. Her children became experts in self-monitoring, in reading her moods, in anticipating her desires before she spoke them. Independence was not merely discouraged. It became unthinkable. Even as adults, her children struggled to reclaim themselves. Therapy, separation, and distance from the household could only partially undo the psychological architecture she had constructed. Many carried a perpetual sense of inadequacy, a lingering voice in their minds, echoing her criticisms and expectations. And yet, paradoxically, some could not entirely sever the bond, finding themselves drawn back into her orbit, unable to reconcile the fear and love that had been so intricately entwined. This paradox, love intertwined with terror, loyalty enforced through manipulation, is the essence of what makes her story so disturbing and so unforgettable. And as we uncover more about her life, one chilling truth emerges. She believed, with unshakable conviction, that she was acting in the best interests of her children. In her mind, every manipulation, every restriction, every exercise of control was an act of love. It is this conviction, this self-righteous certainty, that makes her actions even more haunting. A mother who could justify psychological tyranny as devotion, who could create suffering while seeing only virtue. In the quiet corners of history, her story reminds us that horror often wears the face of care, and that the most devastating legacies are those built in silence. By the later years of her life, the full scope of her influence over her children had become tragically apparent. Many had married, had children of their own, and yet the patterns she had instilled persisted. Fear, obedience, and self-doubt were passed down, not as conscious lessons, but as invisible inheritances embedded in the ways her children raised their own families. What she had begun as control over daily life had rippled outward, creating generations who lived under the shadow of her meticulously constructed reality. It is a stark reminder that the consequences of psychological manipulation are rarely confined to a single lifetime. Even her death could not fully sever the grip she had on her family. Letters, journals, and private admonishments continued to circulate long after she was gone, serving as reminders of expectations and the ever-present threat of judgment. Her children, now adults, were left to navigate lives shaped almost entirely by her unseen hand. Some managed to break free, forging identities distinct from the house of shadows she had built. Others struggled, trapped in cycles of anxiety, self-reproach, and emotional paralysis, unable to disentangle themselves from the conditioning that had begun so long ago. Historians who study her story often describe it as a case study in the quiet horror of domestic life, a testament to the power a single individual can exert over the minds of those closest to them. Unlike tales of outward violence or scandal, this story is unsettling precisely because it operates in the invisible realm, the shaping of thought, emotion, and identity without the world ever noticing. It is the type of terror that leaves no bruises, yet haunts the spirit, echoing across decades and reminding us that sometimes the most profound horrors are the ones we cannot see. And perhaps the most disturbing truth is that she never saw herself as a villain. To her, every manipulation, every act of control, every orchestrated triumph or humiliation was an act of care. This is the paradox at the heart of her story, a mother whose love was inseparable from cruelty, whose devotion was inseparable from domination. She teaches us that evil does not always shout, it often whispers, wrapping itself in ribbons of propriety, loyalty, and care, so that those living within it cannot recognize its full power until it is too late. By examining her life through the lens of history, we are confronted not only with her personal cruelty, but with broader truths about human psychology and family dynamics. She exemplifies how power can be exercised quietly, invisibly, and yet with devastating precision. In her Victorian household, love and terror were inseparable. Obedience was indistinguishable from devotion, and every child's identity was a canvas upon which she painted her own vision. It is a lesson in how trauma can be both subtle and pervasive, leaving marks that are invisible to the eye, but indelibly etched into the psyche. What makes her case particularly haunting is the lingering ambiguity of intention. She was not a monster in the traditional sense. She did not seek to harm for pleasure. Rather, she sought to perfect, to control, to impose a vision of order and propriety. And yet, the very act of control, no matter how well-intentioned in her mind, became an instrument of suffering. Her story reminds us that the line between care and cruelty can be perilously thin, and that the human mind is capable of justifying acts of domination under the guise of love. Some of her children, now grown and recorded in historical accounts, tried to reclaim what had been stolen: their autonomy, their sense of self, their ability to feel unmonitored joy. Many struggled for the habits she had instilled, the self-surveillance, the constant doubt, the conflation of obedience with affection, were deeply ingrained. And yet, there were those who managed to step outside her shadow, carving paths defined not by fear, but by choice. Their stories, intertwined with hers, form a haunting testament to the enduring effects of psychological manipulation and the resilience required to survive it. It is in this intersection of horror and resilience that her story finds its full resonance. She remains a figure who challenges our understanding of maternal influence, morality, and psychological power. And as we peel back the layers of her life, we are left to grapple with the uncomfortable truth. Sometimes the most disturbing figures in history are those who appear most ordinary, whose cruelty is measured not in blood, but in the quiet, persistent reshaping of the human soul. Even today, the echoes of her influence ripple through the descendants and the few historical records that survived. Scholars who study her life are struck not by sensational acts, but by the subtlety and consistency of her methods. Letters, diaries, and accounts from those who lived under her roof reveal patterns of control so methodical that they read like a blueprint for psychological domination. Each word, each decision, each interaction was carefully calibrated, leaving a trail of obedience and fear that extended far beyond her immediate presence. The horror of her story lies in its quietness. There were no public scandals, no violent outbursts, just decades of invisible manipulation that warped the identities of those who should have been most loved and protected. This is why her case resonates with historians and psychologists alike. It demonstrates that the most profound trauma is often delivered in silence, in whispers, in the minutiae of everyday life. Her home was a laboratory of the human psyche, and her children were unwitting subjects, their identities crafted not by nurture alone, but by careful, unrelenting control. And yet, within this darkness, there are glimpses of humanity that make her story even more complex. Her meticulous care, her attention to detail, her insistence on propriety, these were not absent. They were twisted, redirected into instruments of power rather than acts of genuine nurture. It is the juxtaposition of devotion and cruelty, care and domination that makes her story so compelling and so deeply disturbing. We are forced to confront the uncomfortable truth that love can be a vessel for control, and that the line between guidance and oppression is sometimes invisible until it is too late. Her legacy is a cautionary tale, a chilling reminder of how power, even when wielded in the name of love, can become a form of imprisonment. And as we study her life, we are compelled to ask uncomfortable questions about the nature of influence, the fragility of autonomy, and the ways in which those we trust most can shape our very selves without our awareness. The story of America's most disturbing Victorian mother is not just a historical curiosity. It is a psychological case study, a warning and a haunting portrait of human complexity in its darkest form.